Welcome to the Trees and Lines podcast, where we discuss fresh perspectives on utility vegetation management. Don't forget to follow along on LinkedIn for the latest news. Now, let's dive into this week's episode. Welcome to another episode of the Trees and Lines podcast. Today, it's our pleasure to welcome Brian Sprinkle again as my co-host in place of Tej Singh. Our guest today is Dean Mutrie, a name that those of you in the pipeline industry or familiar with the Right of Way Symposium series, you'll know well. Dean, welcome to Trees and Lines.
Thanks very much, Phil. Glad to be here.
How about you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about your career and your interests.
Well, I was born in Toronto and went to university at a place called University Waterloo in Southern Ontario. I'm kind of a generalist by training. I'm not a forester. I took environmental studies in university. So in essence, it's kind of like I'm kind of like a generalist, and I ended up specializing in pipelines through a consulting firm I worked with in Southern Ontario. And then 1980, I moved to Calgary, Alberta, Western Canada, because I wanted to work on more pipelines, and Calgary was the pipeline capital of Canada, or still is. My career kind of took off from there. So my focus, I initially got into pipelines doing assessments for regulatory filings. I got voluntold to come out on the pipeline during construction by the project manager because he felt I was pretty green, and I used to come up with some really stupid recommendations for protecting the environment. And he said, okay, when we build this, you're coming out as the environmental inspector. So my wife wasn't too impressed because we just got married, and I went out pipelining for 3 months. But it was probably the best investment of time and energy I could ever make, because it opened my eyes to how things really get done in the field. As an environmental person, you've got to make your stuff practical and effective for it to actually happen on the ground. If you just, wave a big book, an environmental impact statement at the contractor, he'll just blow you off. So anyway, it was a great experience for me, and I sort of springboarded that experience into introducing myself to pipeline companies in Calgary. We started small. There was 2 of us. When the company was sold in around 2015, it was about 450 people. So the pipeline business has been very good to me. And I should also mention that we also got into power lines as well. Some of the pipelines, I'll just briefly, most were in Alberta, but lots in Western Canada, BC, Saskatchewan. And then we worked on 3 Alaska pipelines, 3 versions of the Alaska pipeline. None of them got built. I did get to work on a few pipelines into the U.S., so into Montana, Wyoming, through Montana, Idaho, Oregon, California, and Nevada. So pipelines are kind of my thing. And I've been involved in that symposium you mentioned. It's called the International Symposium on Environmental Concerns in Rights of Way Management. I've been involved in that since the second one in 1979.
You're a keynote speaker this year?
Yeah, we're going to kick off. It's actually the 50-year celebration, because the first one was in Mississippi State University in Starkville, Mississippi in 1976. So it's 50 years of Right of Way Symposia. And the next one is going to be in Vancouver, BC in May 11th to 14th.
May 11th to 14th. Mark your calendars. It is a great conference. So as a keynote speaker, it sort of all came together when you told me your role in that. You're sharing it with Ann Beard. Am I right?
Yeah, that's right. We're going to kick off the opening night before the evening before the actual conference starts. It'll be kind of a buffet dinner and an open bar, and then we'll have hopefully an hour and a half of interesting conversations talking about the history of the Right of Way Symposia. It was started by Dr. Dale Arner at Mississippi State University, and he came at it from the perspective of trying to improve wildlife habitat. He got together a bunch of like-minded individuals, the professors and a few practitioners in wildlife and in vegetation management, and had the first symposium. Then after that, the scope of the symposium grew quite a bit. Ann Arbor was 1979 at University of Michigan, and there was quite a few more subjects dealing with things like route selection, environmental assessment, a bit on social interactions, but quite a bit still on vegetation and wildlife management. And then it just kind of grew from there, and it was kind of an organic organization. There was no overarching organization behind it. It was just who was sort of dumb enough to put their hand up to volunteer to hold the next one. So the third one was in I think 1982 in San Diego. Ed Colson of Pacific Gas and Electric and another, I think maybe Al Crabtree, were the chairman. And San Diego in February was a real hit with Canadians, so there was quite a good Canadian contingent down there. And again, the subject started expanding, anything to do with rights of way and the environment. So there was started to be some really interesting papers. After San Diego, it was Indianapolis, then Montreal, then New Orleans, and then we had the whole group up to Calgary in the year 2000. Had to worry about Y2K, which turned out to be nothing, but at the time it was a big scare. And then it was in Saratoga Springs, New York. Then places like Phoenix, Halifax, Denver, Charlotte, and now the next one's going to be Vancouver.
Yeah, good. So give us a rundown, or just an idea of the scope of the program this year. It's not veg management. It's not just pipeline. I mean, it really has grown into quite the program.
Yeah, that's right. It changes quite a bit over the years, and that's part of what my opening address is going to be, kind of trying to capture the changes in subject matter over the years. But it's really the only conference I'm aware of where you get people from different disciplines and different utility types all together in a room so they can learn from each other. Like normally you go to a conference, it's all foresters or all biologists kind of thing. Here you get everything from engineers to foresters to many different kinds of biologists, botanists, archaeologists, sociologists, ologists. And this year, we started off with kind of a welcome celebration and a history of the symposium series. And Beard is going to address the vegetation management changes over the last 50 years. On the Tuesday, May the 12th, the program gets underway in full swing with a keynote speaker who will be, I think, an Indigenous member from British Columbia, who's actually involved in most of the big projects in Canada now have equity ownership by Indigenous organizations. And this gentleman's going to be talking about that. And then there'll be a plenary session of about 5 or 6 people, regulators, and key people involved, practitioners on both sides of the border, talking about rights of way and transition. Following that, we break into concurrent sessions for the next 2 or 3 days. There's usually one stream on vegetation management, one on wildlife management, and then another one kind of capturing everything else. There's been a lot of interest lately in things like GIS and technology, drones and remote sensing, satellite imagery, using that for vegetation management, and even other things such as route selection. And then there's a couple other plenary sessions, and then it wraps up on, I think, the Wednesday afternoon.
Yeah, well, good. It always is a great turnout, and just want to encourage anybody involved in Rights of Way to attend. So, Dean, let's switch back to your career, though, on pipelines. Are you still working?
No.
Oh, okay.
I retired, I guess, in 2015 or 2016. A few colleagues of mine and I were trying to kickstart a pipeline project to Hudson Bay, which is a place called Churchill, which is actually an Arctic port, and it's been there in existence for about 90 years. It was built to take grain from the prairie provinces out through Hudson Bay, Hudson Strait, and into the Atlantic Ocean. It's got lots of challenges. It's icebound for, I think, 8 months of the year, so the shipping season's only 4 months long. But one aspect of climate change is that's lengthening every year, and there's real interest in the way geopolitics are in the world today, with Russia invading Ukraine and our challenges in North America. There's interest in
very political of you there.
There's interest in Canada to open up new tidewater ports, and so Canada, we're fortunate to have 3 coasts, not 2.
Yeah. Good. Brian, you want to interject here? I know you had some questions about his work on pipelines.
Yeah, no, I find the pipeline industry fascinating. And I think one of the questions I was going to have for you, Dean, is, we look at the we talk a lot about the electric grid and how that operates and the regionality of regulators, et cetera. But what I've seen in the industry, in the pipeline industry specifically, and we'll just focus on oil and gas. I know that there's water and other infrastructure, but just in the oil and gas sector, the decentralization of operations and ideology of management, and then the decentralization of regulatory boundaries or requirements that pipeline operators have to abide by. And in that space, have you seen over the course of your career that change tremendously? And the second part of that question is, what are the impacts of that decentralization of ideologies and regulatory boundaries?
If I deal with maybe Canada first, both oil and gas pipelines in Canada, anything that crosses a provincial boundary is federal jurisdiction. And that used to be the National Energy Board. Now it's the Canadian Energy Regulator. And there are very high standards for applying for, going through that process. There's usually public hearings, and there's lots of opportunity for public participation and engagement. To be honest, in Canada, it was sort of timely, my exit from the pipeline industry, because the pipeline industry in Canada has been dead for 10 years. There are so many challenges trying to build you think of a a pipeline is essentially a long transect. The longest one I've worked on is over 2,000 kilometers. It was from northeastern British Columbia to the Saskatchewan, North Dakota border. And so you've got 3 provinces, you've got probably 100 First Nations. You've got in that particular project, there's most of the First Nations had ceded land rights under treaties, but most of British Columbia is unceded territory. And so the First Nations hold huge sway in British Columbia because they're under no obligation to help grant you a right of way or cooperate or any of that. And it's become very frustrating for pipeline operators. I worked on one oil line to Vancouver, and there was probably 40 First Nations. 38 of them were on board. They were quite happy with the pipeline project. Pipeline operators nowadays are very savvy, and they do get First Nations involved through benefits agreements and things like that. But there was 2 coastal First Nations right where the terminal was going to be in Vancouver that were highly opposed to it. Between that and various environmental challenges, what used to take 10 years or 2 years took 10 years to get it approved. Everything has become way more expensive. There was another pipeline proposed to a place called Kitimat. It was going to be an oil pipeline about 10 years ago. The operator had gone through the regulatory process, was probably within a year of construction, and the federal government at the time passed a law that a moratorium on tanker traffic from that part of northern BC. Essentially, it just killed the project, and the operator had to eat $600 million.
Oh.
So no pipeline company in Canada wants to build in Canada anymore. Actually, they're the 2 biggest, Enbridge and TC Energy, are pretty active in the United States. Not so much here anymore. So that's what I know of Canada. And if the U.S. is different in that FERC regulates natural gas pipelines, but not oil pipelines. When you're running a multi-state project of any length, it's actually comforting to have a FERC certificate, because that gives you, I don't think anybody uses it anymore, but at least it gives you the right of eminent domain once that FERC certificate is issued. But I think in most cases, I think both in Canada and the US, I think we've seen the last of the big pipelines. There's sort of small tie-ins and laterals and small things like that. But, as we understand it, I think we all recognize that fossil fuels are, they keep saying that we've peaked, but we haven't peaked yet. But it'll be a gradual wind down, and unless they can convert these steel tubes to some other commodity, it's going to be a sunk cost. So I don't see anybody putting up billions and billions of dollars to build a giant project like the Alaska line anymore.
And is that most of your work was construction?
No, we did the regulatory stuff, the upfront applications, and route selection. My personal love was doing routing. You'd go off for 2 weeks in a helicopter flying all over Western Canada or the US, picking pipeline routes. That was the thing that I loved the most, but doing the paperwork afterwards was the hard part. But in the US, putting together environmental impact statements, Canada, we call them environmental assessments. That was a big part of what our company did. Then go through the regulatory phase with either expert witness testimony, and then go through things like data requests or information requests, then yeah, our company would also be involved putting environmental inspectors out on each pipeline spread. And then also we would monitor the reclamation of the pipeline right away afterwards. So it's kind of a full cycle kind of thing. And one thing that was going to catch on, I think, in both countries is the issue of pipeline abandonment. I'm not so familiar with this issue with power lines, but there's thousands of kilometers of pipelines now that are past their prime and have served their purpose. Pipeline abandonment can be extremely expensive if you're required to yank the steel out of the ground. That's a massive surface disturbance and disruption to the landowners and land use. And I think regulators came on hard, at least the National Energy Board at the time came on very hard. They became very demanding in what their requirements for abandonment, and industry got very nervous because they hadn't really put enough money away for putting these facilities to bed. So anyway, I think they're in a kind of a middle ground now, and a lot of companies are keeping pipelines on the books. They fill them with inert gas and keep the cathodic protection going. Just because it's cheap to do that. They don't know what else to do with it. Hopefully somebody else can come along and recondition it for some other purpose.
Yeah, I can't imagine the impact of pulling out all that line.
Yeah, especially, water crossings. This last project I worked on was the looping the oil pipeline to Vancouver from Edmonton. In British Columbia alone, there were 650 river crossings. Wow. And each one of those, especially in British Columbia, they're all full of salmon and other game fish, cold water species. It's a big issue when you start doing that.
Yeah, I wonder if there's an avenue, because I know the abandoned line piece is a big, as you just discussed, it's a big issue, right? You put a line in the ground 50, 60 years ago. It's exceeded the time of its lifespan. It started to degrade. It's not suitable to maybe still can carry natural gas or oil or because of leaks and contamination and environmental concerns. But I wonder if there's an avenue where they can repurpose those pipelines for other purposes, such as like undergrounding electric transmission systems in the pipeline and pull the wire through there and maybe reuse that for something else, or maybe dual purpose right of ways where the gas pipeline systems, at least on the transmission side of the gas pipeline, where they run a long ways, they've already maintained that space. They have the easement language. Maybe partnering with fiber communication companies, water companies, electric companies, and using that more so for multiple things rather than just one avenue: oil, gas, water, etc.
Yeah, no, you're right. That makes a lot of sense. In undergrounding, as a alternative to overhead towers, I understand, from a construction point of view, undergrounding is prohibitively expensive at the construction stage, by a factor of 10 or 15. But you're right, if it's in the ground, and if it's going the right way, you could use it as a conduit or casing. There's a lot of interest in things like hydrogen, which you could ship ammonia as a liquid and then convert it to hydrogen at tidewater. There's a lot of interest in things like potash in a slurry, coal slurry. There's been a lot of studies into that. And as you mentioned, every pipeline that's been built in the last 10 years includes a fiber optic line in the right of way. A lot of it is for remote control of valves and things, so it can all be controlled from 1,000 miles away in the control room. So yeah, there's a great opportunity, and I think that's also why the regulators, or at least the Canadian Energy Regulator, backed off a bit, that there could be an opportunity for repurposing abandoned pipelines.
Yeah.
You're right. Our demand hasn't changed much, except maybe to go up, but we certainly have constrained what we can provide or how we can provide it. So it'll be interesting to see what happens to those pipelines going forward.
Yeah, and on that topic too, with gas pipeline infrastructure, we talked a little bit about oil and gas. We talked about, you mentioned a little bit about climate change, and especially up in the Canadian area and in Alaska, where permafrost is present. Some of these pipelines sit on, from what I've seen, I'm a novice in the pipeline industry, so bear with me, but some pipelines are above ground, some are below. I drove out when I was working in Alaska, probably 100 miles of I think it's the Valdez pipeline that runs from up north to I can't remember exactly where it ends, but with that nuance of being above or below ground, especially in these areas that are impacted by climate change, and one of the pieces of that is melting permafrost. Melting permafrost causes frost lenses, which then cause sinkholes, a variety of other issues. How is the gas pipeline industry thinking about that from an environmental standpoint, a construction standpoint? How are they dealing with that piece? As things change, especially with these decadent lines that we have in the ground, either abandoned or still in use.
No, that's a great question, and I think you're thinking of the Alyeska line from Prudhoe Bay to Valdez, and which incidentally, I understand there is an LNG pipeline proposed from Prudhoe, so a gas pipeline from Prudhoe to Valdez, and then a liquefaction facility planned for Valdez. And I think that one's probably got legs, and I think it's well along in the permitting. But anyway, back to your question about permafrost, that's a great question, because I can remember years ago I was doing these courses for FERC about their natural gas compliance, environmental compliance program, and they asked me, what do we do about wetlands in Canada? And I said, well, we just wait till they freeze in winter and then walk across them with a D9. So, but yeah, you're right. We don't have that luxury so much anymore. You're getting much more discontinuous permafrost, more thawing of the ground, and it becomes super unstable. There's been really good advances in pipeline construction techniques. In the old days, they used to use wood chips to bury ice-rich slopes, until they found out that in the summertime, those wood chips would start to decompose, heat up.
Yeah.
You get thermal degradation, so you're kind of speeding up the thing you're trying to prevent. But there's been great advancements in geotextiles and foam insulation. And I think any new pipeline, for instance, this one that my friends and I are looking at to go to Churchill, Manitoba, the southern 200 kilometers of that route is discontinuous permafrost. And I think the way you do that is you build a very wide, thick gravel pad. Essentially, it's a linear gravel pad that's on geotextile and insulation. And then you essentially trench through the gravel pad and lay the pipe in that. It's still very, very expensive, but in our case, it's much cheaper than building through the mountains of British Columbia. There's 3 mountain ranges from Edmonton to Vancouver versus no mountain ranges and a bunch of permafrost going to Churchill. But I think it's going to become an issue, or it is becoming an issue for instability on existing pipelines. Pipelines that were previously built in permafrost are starting to melt and so it's becoming a maintenance issue. I think that's probably going to be that's one of the major things impacting operating pipelines in the north.
You did a course, right? Didn't I was thinking that you had developed an inspection course or something that was used nationally.
Yeah. Sorry, it was there was something called Petroleum Industry Training Service in Calgary, and it was not the greatest acronym. It was PIT, but they changed their name to NFORM later on, and they would run environmental courses for oil field operators. And myself and another fellow, we started a course in 1988 on pipeline environmental inspection, and it was always scheduled for a breakup period in northern Canada. There's the breakup period in early April when nobody can move because if you're working up north on frozen muskeg, that starts to break up. So you got to be out of there. And then in the summertime, you can work on farmland. So it's a good time to catch inspectors on their downtime. And we ran a 3-day course on what to look for from an environmental perspective, practical issues dealing with things like stripping topsoil, crossing rivers, clearing timber, salvaging timber, ditching, and in a way that saves the topsoil, and then reclaiming the right of way afterwards. And that was the course that it was really strange. We'd have like 40 oil field operators, and then we had 2 or 3 guys from FERC in Washington show up to our course. And then the next year we had like 5 people from Washington show up. And then they asked us to teach the course in Washington, which was kind of a culture shock. But I took some of the instructors to Washington, D.C., and it turned out that I think on the American side, the U.S. was well ahead of Canada in terms of assessing impacts, but the problem was they just assumed once the environmental impact statement was filed and there was all these constraints put on the contractor, they just assumed it would happen. But without environmental inspection, there was no way to make that happen. And so we gave a couple of courses to FERC, and then FERC asked me to join their third-party contractor who was doing their environmental impact statements to travel around the U.S. To various cities, giving a course. They called it the Natural Gas Environmental Compliance Course. And I think that might be what you were thinking about, Phil, in terms of universities. And so it was quite interesting. We also got contacted by companies like Transco in Houston. They had just got whacked with a $10 million fine by FERC for just purposely destroying an archaeological site. And everybody involved in that at the upper management side got fired, and the new upper management said, okay, we got to get smart about this construction inspection issue. And we were engaged to give a course in Houston. And I think nowadays it's second nature. It's a big part of every project that there's the environmental assessment, the environmental impact statement, and then there's an environmental protection plan written in construction specification language or language that's familiar to contractors. And those specs are given to the contractor to bid on. They become part of the contract, legally binding. And then the contractor's required to perform those those conditions, environmental conditions, and the company hires inspectors to enforce those conditions. And that's been pretty standard in both countries now for about the last 30 years.
Very good. Dean, I think we're closing in here. I want to go back for a minute to the Right of Way Symposium, because you were around since when was your first one?
Ann Arbor in 1979. That was number 2.
So in 79, you knew some of the really earliest people in our industry. So that had to be a really interesting time to enter into the right-of-way industry. Any stories you can tell us?
The second Right of Way Symposium in Ann Arbor in 1979, the keynote speaker was a gentleman named Frank Egler. And Mr. Egler, or Dr. Egler, had, I guess, gotten into vegetation management in the U.S. Northeast in the 60s. And he wrote a book called The Plight of the Right-of-Way Domain in 1966. And he carried on doing research on especially the vegetation management aspects of rights of way. And he did that probably for 15, 20 years. And he wasn't involved in the Right of Way Symposium started by Dr. Arner and other wildlife managers in 1976. So I think Dr. Egler wanted to get his 2 cents in. He wasn't kind to the new people that came into the field, because he felt that it was a field that he sort of had developed on his own. But at any rate, he gave an interesting keynote speech in Ann Arbor. He was very critical of some of the consultants at the time, that he thought they were taking their clients to the cleaners. But anyway, nobody got hurt. There was no fist fight, didn't break out or anything like that. But it made for an interesting discussion. On the other side, there was people like Gus Tillman. Phil, you were saying that you trained with some of these gentlemen in the early days as well.
Yeah, the Burns and Bramble are who I spent most of my time with, and I'm always amazed that most of the people, or a lot of the people, don't. Who's that? and they were such a big part of my career. So always interesting.
One thing I might do is, if you go to the Right of Way Symposium website, which is Rights of Way, it's hyphenated, rightsofway.org, you can look up the past proceedings. They're all online there. And there's probably 10,000 pages of pure gold. A lot of things that we think we're discovering for the first time, you can go back through those proceedings and you'll see somebody wrote a paper about it 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So I encourage everybody to go visit the website and have a look at the past proceedings. And if you're interested, join us in Vancouver in May.
Very good. Brian, I heard you might be going, so
maybe, yeah. It's on the maybe list. Yeah, it seems like a fascinating conference. I kind of wanted to go back to a question that was popped up in my mind about, you mentioned that we're slowing down on building more, and I think that the driver behind that is the ideological shift away from fossil fuel utilization, cultural norms, environmental impact, etc. But from a geopolitical standpoint, not to get political, but just from a national security standpoint, the distribution of energy, either electric, gas, etc., is critical to be able to shift and keep supply chains operating when things happen. And so, do you feel like that the slowing down of building has an impact not only on national defense, but also the overall economy in terms of how we move things around? Because I think of right now, a lot of trades, goods, etc., oil, other liquids that could be pipeline. There's a lot of semis on the road that are moving this stuff around. Maybe that's a a data point to think about of the future from a sociological or societal or humanities standpoint of how we can distribute these things easily to the masses as our economies grow and subsequently populations shift around, move to different places. Is that something that's a concern in your mind, or is that something that you thought about?
Yeah, well, specifically with oil, the alternative to pipelines is oil by rail, and
Yeah.
that's been a bit of a stopgap measure because the rail lines are already in the ground. It's just a question of putting rail cars and putting trains together. As a pipeliner, you're probably not surprised to hear that I'm not very excited about oil by rail.
Yeah, because we're not building more rail either, really, for the most part.
No, that's right. But there's a safety issue.
It's above ground. Yeah.
I don't know if you've heard of a place called Lac Mégantic in Quebec.
No.
About 10 years ago, a fly-by-night American rail company, well, I shouldn't say American, it's just a fly-by-night rail company, which was taking oil from Montreal to Portland, Maine, had to go through a place called Lac Mégantic, and it was cold. They had a train full of oil cars, and they had just arranged a deal where they only needed one engineer and one conductor per train. With 100 rail cars, it's sort of an accident waiting to happen. They parked the train overnight in town, set what they thought were the right number of brakes. Sure enough, there was a fire in the engine that night. The fire department came, put the fire out, but in the process, they turned off the power to the brakes. And around 2 a.m, the train started rolling. And that train rolled 10 miles into a little village called Lac Mégantic. And there was a big curve in the middle of the town, and there was a nightclub there. All the cars, or I don't know, half the train derailed. It was very volatile Bakken crude from North Dakota, ignited instantly. Long story short, 43 people died.
Wow.
And that's the issue with not allowing pipelines are the absolute safest way to carry oil and gas. If you don't let companies build pipelines, if you try and get by with rail, I believe there's a real safety issue.
Yeah. Yeah. That's I have to look more into that. That's very sad. But not only on the safety side, but the efficiency side, right? So rail can only carry so many gallons, but a pipeline can pump hundreds of gallons a minute at all times.
Yeah, it's nothing for a big pipeline to do 1 million barrels a day. That would be like 20 trains or so, but then you got to get the trains back to the starting point empty.
Mm-hmm.
The upside of trains is that the rail's already there. You can start rolling oil cars tomorrow. Whereas with pipelines now, like we talked before, this last pipeline from Edmonton to Vancouver that I worked on, it took 10 years to build. The original budget was $8 billion. It came in at $34 billion. And the federal government had to take it over because the owner of the pipeline had basically thrown up their hands and said, "We're done. We can't build in this environment." They'd invested a couple of billion by that point, and it was just becoming a sinkhole of money. So the federal government actually had to move in, take ownership of the project, and at that point, it was a blank check. every environmental group and First Nation in Western Canada came out of the woodwork. And so 8 billion grew to 34 billion. So that's, and that's where the rail company will say, well, we've got the right of way already. Let's just start shipping oil.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe it's a combination of both of those things at the end of the day, where you still use the rails for oil or other things that would be pumped through pipeline in lieu of to help offset those types of risks.
Yeah.
Fascinating component of that, the pipeline industry that I was thinking about. But I appreciate you answering my question on that, Dean.
All across all the energy sectors, it'll be interesting to see how we keep fueling the growth of our countries.
Yeah.
While protecting them.
Absolutely.
Very good. Dean, I sure do appreciate your spending the time. I know you probably want to be fishing. Well, not today, I guess. but other things to do in your retirement. I sure do appreciate your joining us. And
well, thanks for the opportunity, Phil, and nice to meet you too, Brian.
Yeah,
and I appreciate the chance to talk about pipelines. It's something near and dear to my heart, and also the symposium.
Yeah, well, very good. And I hope many of our listeners show up at the symposium. It is a great conference. Thanks for joining us today. Follow us on LinkedIn for updates and to tune in again to the Trees and Lines podcast.